Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm exploring something you might not have heard of before. I certainly hadn't until I started researching it for the show, and that is the rainbow ceiling. Now, you've probably heard of a glass ceiling, the metaphor for the various structural barriers and things that hold down women or minority groups as they're trying to climb the career ladder and prevent them from reaching top jobs. A rainbow ceiling is the same thing, but applies to LGBTQ plus people. It's a rainbow partly because that's the symbol of LGBTQ plus, but also the concept of the arc of a rainbow suggests that different people are affected in different ways. Now, it's like me or straight, you might not ever have given much thought to what it's like to be LGBTQ plus, why those who are can find life more difficult. You might even think, as I know I have if I'm being honest, it all seems a bit of an unnecessary fuss. But my guest, Dr. Layla McCay, has written a book called Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling: How LGBTQ plus people can thrive and succeed at work. And as you'll hear, although this is ostensibly a book to help those people, it's also incredibly insightful for everyone else. In fact, there were so many things in there that made me challenge the way I looked at the world that I wanted to get her onto the show. In reading it, I had some revelations that I didn't really understand some of the challenges faced by LGBTQ plus people, and I figured that if that applies to me, well, it might apply to some of you as well. But my revelations went further than just a simple lack of understanding, because I also came to realize that I had often inadvertently either helped to foster a work environment that wasn't as inclusive as it could have been, or not done simple things that I could have done to make it more inclusive. Now, I think inclusion is important, not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because by excluding people, we're not getting the best out of everyone and the cognitive diversity that can offer. By understanding the challenges that are faced by LGBTQ plus people, we can start to think about some of the ways that we work and design environments in a society that is more inclusive and therefore more productive. And let's face it, given the challenges we've got in the 21st century, we want everybody's brains helping out on that. Before we begin with this episode, I know it's often taken as read that people know what LGBTQ plus means. So if you're not familiar with that, do have a look in the show notes. I've put some links there. With that said, here's my discussion with an author that's changed my mind on something and really made me see things through a different perspective. It's Dr. Layla McCay on the rainbow ceiling. Layla, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you. Such a delight to be here.
I'm really excited to have you because, as I was saying to you before we started recording, your book really opened my eyes in all sorts of ways. But before we come on and talk about that, we should probably talk about you. So can you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I am trained as a medical doctor, and after working for quite a few years in the NHS, I ended up moving into health policy. So I've worked in the Department of Health for the British government. And then I worked overseas at the World Health Organization and the World Bank, and for various international charities, NGOs, and set up a little think tank called the Centre for Urban Design and Mental Health. And these days, I am working as Director of Policy for the NHS Confederation. So essentially representing the needs and views of NHS organisations, trying to encourage the policies that are made to support the NHS. So none of that is particularly focused on this book. But in my spare time, as part of my role, I run the executive lead for the Healthcare LGBTQ plus leaders network.
Which is a beautiful segue into the book, Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling. Tell us what's it about?
So it's about this concept of a rainbow ceiling, which is essentially, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of a glass ceiling, which is a metaphor for all the various structural barriers and things that hold down women or minority groups as they're trying to climb the career ladder and sort of stop them at a certain point being able to ascend to those top jobs. So what I'm calling the rainbow ceiling is this sort of concept applied to LGBTQ plus people. And I like to think of it as a rainbow, partly because, of course, that is a symbol of LGBTQ plus people, but also the concept of the arc of a rainbow is that different people are affected in different ways. Particular people are extra disadvantaged or in terms of the intersectionality of being LGBTQ plus having other characteristics that might have those effects can all combine to mean LGBTQ plus people are less likely to get to the top jobs. So, for example, if you think of the Fortune 500 companies, that's the 500 biggest companies in America. So that's 500 CEOs. Only three of them right now are LGBTQ plus, or at least known to be publicly. That's clearly a really significant underrepresentation. So I'm interested in why is that the case? And really, it's what I've been looking to explain in the book.
Reading as a straight man, I obviously found it fascinating because I was coming at it from the angle of saying, well, does this problem actually exist? Because I like to believe, and this is speaking from a massive position of privilege, clearly, I'd like to believe that we're in a world now today where people can be who they want to be. We have things like gay marriage. So, haven't we solved this particular problem? And what you start to point out is to say, well, actually, that statistic that you just quoted is a sort of opening. You started to point out that there's lots and lots of evidence that basically that actually the world isn't in the way that I would have when I approached the book. We're not living in a world of equal opportunities, and there are these barriers in place. So, how did you go about researching that?
Well, I did a bit of a combination of things. One was that I pulled together the research that already exists, and honestly, it's not the strongest of research. It's mostly lots of surveys that have been done in various different ways in various countries around the world, quite often commissioned by particular workplaces. But I brought all of that together, looked at all these surveys, and uh, some of the really, really big numbers of people across the world asking all these different questions and thought, cool, what does that tell us? Looked up the academic research, cool, what does that tell us? But then the main thing of this book is that I brought this research together with people's personal experiences. So I interviewed more than 40 people who are LGBTQ plus, most of whom were at a really senior level of their careers. And as I just mentioned, it's pretty unusual to be at that level as an LGBTQ plus person, or of course as anyone. But it's particularly difficult. So I interviewed these people to try and understand what helped them succeed. What were the things that got in their way as they were climbing the career ladder? And what did they find was particularly helpful in enabling them to achieve their aspirations? And I spoke to all those people, all sorts of different sectors, different business areas, different countries. I think about can't quite remember the number, but something like 15 countries are covered in the book. People's different experiences. Of course, everybody has a very different experience. As I started to interview those people, I started to see quite a lot of common themes emerging, and from that, was able to pull these learnings and insights together to tell us all some new information.
And the bit that really astonished me was you picked, for example, business travel, where LGBTQ plus people can feel disadvantaged. Can you just explain that? Because like that's the last thing I would have thought of as being something that was potentially discriminatory. You sort of think, well, but it's travel, it's an opportunity to go see. But you rightly point out that even in something that could seem innocuous like that, actually there's dynamics. And I thought that was a fascinating example of the sort of hidden challenges that are out there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And quite a lot of the people I interviewed raised that. So there's obviously a few different things to that, but one is in quite a lot of careers, being able to go on business trips is a bit of a career enhancing opportunity. And people are quite keen to do that. But quite often it's the case that those business trips are going to places where perhaps it's illegal to be LGBTQ plus, or perhaps it might not be illegal, but cultural norms have dictated that it's very difficult and people will be prejudiced against you or perhaps discriminate against you. And perhaps you would feel quite unsafe if you were known to be LGBTQ plus in those countries. And people gave me all sorts of examples of where that had happened to them. And, there's interesting things to think about. So first of all, when you're offered the opportunity, it's very rarely the case that your boss or your HR team would think about the implications of asking you as an LGBTQ plus person to go there. So the risk assessment that you're doing, you're kind of doing it on a personal basis. And if you think that's something that's too risky. That's something that you're having to convey to your boss, and you're potentially, missing out on an opportunity, and maybe even having people thinking negatively of you for making that decision. And then if you do go to one of those places where you feel uncomfortable, then people talk about having to go back into the closet. So being in the closet at work it's not great for your mental health and well-being, but actually having to then go back into a closet is can be really quite uncomfortable. And people told me about all sorts of examples of, pretending that they had a fictional spouse of the opposite gender to help feel safe and manage relationships on trips like. And, that has a real impact. It really is quite difficult to maintain those things. I had these sorts of experiences, of course, myself. I used to work in international development, and sometimes I would feel compelled to pretend I had a husband and describe his husband as people would vigorously ask me questions about him, who of course didn't exist. And, there's a real moral injury to having to be inauthentic in that sort of way, but also feeling that for your safety, or perhaps for the benefit of whatever you're trying to achieve on that business trip, you feel obliged to be policing yourself and working on being somebody that you're not, in a way that your colleagues might not have to do.
And this theme of sort of having to pretend that you're something you're not. I mean, obviously, just on a basic human level, lying is unless you happen to be certain politicians to whom it seems to come naturally, but lying is something that we all struggle with a little bit. And I thought it was fascinating. There's this idea that if you've had to sort of come out in your private life, that's been a challenging dynamic for many people. And then you have to do the same thing again at work. And so you may have quote unquote sorted things out for yourself in your private life, but the work environment's fundamentally different. And I thought it was really fascinating the way you were unpicking that. Almost it's a second challenge for people in addition to their day-to-day lives.
Yeah. I mean, it really is. One of the things that unites LGBTQ plus people is that at some point you have to tell people that you have this thing that makes you different from the majority of people. And when you tell someone, they can have all sorts of reactions. There could be rejection, there could be discrimination, there could be all sorts of stress. I mean, one of the reasons that the LGBTQ plus population is overrepresented in the homeless population is for that very reason. So people may have very positive experiences of coming out and sharing that part of their life with whoever, but it is likely to be the case that most people have also had some more negative experiences, maybe some quite traumatic experiences from friends, from family, school, from previous employers. And all of those things weigh on people's minds when they're thinking, gosh, should I come out at work? And sometimes, if you don't come out at the beginning, you kind of miss the boat. People start to assume that you're straight or you're cisgender or whatever it may be. And then it's awkward because you have to really think, am I going to maintain this fiction where I'm hiding what I did at the weekend in case somebody finds out I have a wife? Because that's not the way that I presented myself. So people have challenges at all sorts of different levels of their career where they want to be authentic. They want to, be honest with people, but there's a lot of guilt, a lot of stress when they're not able to do that. And the real anxiety when you're not out that somebody might find out and things might happen as a result. So a bit of a knife edge with a lot of people telling me how worried they were that it might have an impact on their job. And of course, for some people, it does. So it's not an unfounded worry. But what was interesting was that I spoke to so many people about this, and pretty much all of them used the same phrase, which was once I'd come out, it was a weight off my shoulders. They really felt like once they weren't having to do this concealing of who they were and, constant vigilance to make sure that they didn't slip up, then they were able to be themselves and just work more effectively, have better relationships with their colleagues and their clients, and be more productive, be more engaged in meetings, and generally felt that they were able to perform as their better selves.
And talk us through some of the barriers that are there. What other ways do these things manifest themselves?
One of the things that people raised quite a lot was in networking. In many jobs, networking is a key part, and who you know, and building affiliations, things like that. And LGBTQ plus people describe all sorts of challenges with that. So, for example, when you're trying to network, quite often your affiliation, the things you have in common, are particularly helpful in building those networks. And very often it will be around spouses and children and whatever it may be. And if you find that you don't fit into the particular box, then quite often that can be a challenge. People talk about old boys clubs. And for example, that is quite often a very heterosexual vibed situation that would exclude well, famously women, but would also potentially exclude men who didn't fit into that sort of heterosexual stereotype. Likewise, I mean, certainly I personally and various other women I spoke to as queer women would find quite often that you didn't really fit into the networks that were being developed. I spoke to one person in the book who was bisexual, and she gave this great description of how when she was with a woman for quite some time, and she thought she wasn't particularly being discriminated against. And then that relationship ended. She started a relationship with a man, and suddenly she was being invited to all these social events that she suddenly realized had been going on all this time, but she hadn't even known they existed because she hadn't been being invited because she was with a woman at the time. And I think that's very, very interesting because you quite often don't know what you don't know. You think you're not being discriminated against, but then later some little thing might happen and you think, gosh, actually didn't even clock that was a thing. So that's quite interesting. And another area that is of course interesting is in hiring and promotions. And the research was quite alarming from my perspective because, I tended to think that probably being gay hadn't had a significant impact on hiring and promotions. And in fact, one of the reasons I ended up writing the book or being inspired to was a chance conversation that I had had with somebody who'd once been on an interview panel that I'd been a candidate. And he said, "Oh, one of the people in that panel didn't want to appoint you because you're gay." And I thought, wow, there's a sort of thing you theoretically know might happen, but being confronted with the fact that literally that was a conversation that had happened, it was kind of chilling to me. So I was really interested to look into that research, and I found all sorts of interesting things, like that if if it's clear that you're an LGBTQ plus person on your application form, you are really quite significantly less likely to be shortlisted for a job. And that's really problematic because quite often, particularly for junior people, those experiences might, you might have led an LGBTQ plus society or been the representative of a staff group or something, which is really relevant leadership experience. But there's the risk that people will discriminate against you because it's demonstrating that you're an LGBTQ plus person. It's hard to know what to do with that sort of thing. And then, there's various touch points within the HR recruitment process where people can fall down or be discriminated against in ways that you don't really think about until you do think about them, and then you're like, gosh, there's actually quite a lot of barriers here. And just on that promotion piece, I think that what is really interesting, first of all, LGBTQ plus people are a little bit less likely to put themselves forward for promotion. All sorts of reasons to do with imposter syndrome and previous experience. And managers, according to the research, judging LGBTQ plus people's performance a bit more harshly than they would judge other people's performance. So having to perform that better to be seen as the same as others and ready for promotion. And then getting that promotion can become increasingly difficult as you go up the corporate ladder, as you start to get to those really high positions, and people start to think, who do I want to represent the company? And that's where you really start to see that rainbow ceiling crystallizing.
And that's just simply a perception, I guess, in many cases. We're sort of, if we had somebody that's different leading this organization, that becomes the public face of the organization or the public face of this function. And that's potentially problematic. Is that's the logic behind this? Is it's a bit more difficult?
Yeah. And in some ways it's maybe not logic. In some ways it's potentially people's prejudices manifesting. And they might describe it in all sorts of different ways around fit and things like that. But what they really mean is, you don't remind me of myself. don't remind me of my particular lens on the world, which is really where people are going. Quite a few people who are in those leadership positions were telling me that the company needs to be quite bold and committed to its values of inclusion and diversity if it's going to follow through on those ambitions at every level. And sometimes people fall short of that. Sometimes people do lose their nerve, according to the people that I was interviewing, which is sad to see. And I think that another thing we quite often hear about the concept of the glass cliff, which I think also does exist for LGBTQ plus people. What I heard from several people who had been in very senior roles was that there was less opportunity for them to mess up. It felt like there was a lot more leeway for others, but if they did one thing wrong, there wasn't much of a support and they were suddenly plummeting. And I think that that's a thing that we see with other minority groups as well, but it hasn't really been well described for the LGBTQ plus folks. And it was interesting to see that that very much seems to holds true for that population as well.
And I guess one of the interesting challenges here is if you asked some of the people that were engaging in acts of discrimination, so that person that you referred to in the meeting that talked about you in the way that they did, if you asked them, they probably wouldn't recognize prejudice. Nobody's going to sort of sit there and go, "Yes, I am a prejudiced individual." Right? We're going to find ways of justifying our decision making. So we'd come up with a business argument, even if it was some form of raw prejudice. So challenge one is around that. I guess it's not necessarily visible or obvious to people. And one of the things I found interesting about reading the book is thinking about some of the ways I've behaved in the past. I wasn't intentionally setting out to create a non-inclusive environment, but I can see that in some of the ways that you described, that actually the net effect of decisions I'd taken or the way I'd communicated things could well have delivered exactly the outcome that I wouldn't have wanted. And so I think that's challenge number one. And then challenge number two, as you rightly point out in the book, is the fact that unless people have come out or informed the organization that they're LGBTQ plus, we wouldn't know that. So we don't necessarily even know the scale of the problem that we've got. So what you're dealing with here is a very challenging, this has got sort of, well, name of the show, right? It's got human risk written all over it because this is heavily around individuals' willingness to understand. On the case of people like me, it's, do I understand myself? Do I understand the implications of my actions? Probably not, because no one sat me down and talked to them. And the second thing is we don't necessarily know the scale of the problem and the challenge that we're dealing with. How many people are feeling awkward in organization because they won't necessarily tell us either. So this is quite difficult to get. I guess what I'm saying in a really roundabout way is this is quite a difficult thing to get our hands around.
It definitely is. And that question of who is LGBTQ plus is a really circular question, because the only way you can really know in the workplace is, by asking staff. But there's lots of reasons that people would choose not to tick that box on a form, partly because they may well not trust that organization to have their back. They might worry that there might be negative repercussions or some kind of discrimination if they were to tick that box. Or maybe they've had some kind of negative thing happen before, so that would color their decision about whether to do that. I've spoken to all sorts of people at very senior levels who I would have considered to be pretty publicly out, and they would tell me they would hesitate to tick that box sometimes. It's not that long ago since, there were bans on LGBTQ plus people working in certain jobs. So I think that people don't forget that quite that easily. So there's a question of what to do about that. And certainly it seemed from my research that the best thing you can really do is to try and create an atmosphere and policies at your work that demonstrate that you are inclusive of all people, and make people feel more able to trust in your organization with sharing that information. But always recognizing that it's probably going to be an underestimation. So really, if you want to be delivering a workplace and policies that are inclusive of LGBTQ plus people, I guess you just kind of have to get rid of the concept that there's a default of what sort of sexual orientation or gender somebody might have, and just assume anybody may have a wide diversity of these characteristics, just as they might have all sorts of other characteristics, and develop your policies and your communications and anything else you may be doing according to that.
And the thing that I thought was really fascinating was that it's in very small things that you can inadvertently, and let's just give people the benefit of the doubt. Human organizations aren't trying to actively be prejudiced. But there are lots of small things. You talk about policies, for example, very, very small things in the language that we use or the way it can send very powerful signals. And so the thing I really took away was sort of thinking that yes, you need the big gestures and you need to make the big statements, but you also need to some of this is just about just literally small things like the language that we use. And so this is pervasive across the way that we communicate and the way that the processes that we run. You talk in the book about recruitment processes, promotion processes, all the sort of HRE type processes. But what fascinated me was that it really, and this in part, this is the scale of the challenge. But I think also what you point towards is that the solution is also in small things as well. If we can start to pick lots of small things, suddenly we can start to improve the whole piece. But this really requires people to think a lot about what, if you're not affected by this, you might think was a very small dynamic, the language that we use. But actually, your point in the book is this is quite significant. These small things can have a big impact.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Because everybody, when they're looking for whatever the policy may be, it's like, how is that going to affect that one specific person? So yes, I was thinking, for example, about a story that somebody told me, a trans person who was going up for an interview, and then they had to write their reference information, but that was in their previous gender. And essentially, in order to have that conversation, to achieve the references, they essentially had to out that person, use their dead name, and all sorts of things that were, quite offensive and potentially a little bit risky. So it's thinking about how do you manage these situations? It's not like there aren't ways to manage them. It's just that some people might not think about them because they haven't encountered that particular risk before. So they haven't thought about how to mitigate it. And things like developing policies for maternity. And I was speaking to a gay man who was having a baby with his partner by surrogacy, and he was saying there just wasn't a policy that covered it. And it wasn't like HR weren't able to then, cobble together what that policy might be. But the fact that they went there and no policy applied to their particular situation, it just made them feel like they didn't belong, that they weren't as good as other people, that they didn't somehow deserve to have a policy that covered their situation. And I think that that sort of experience is a really interesting one. There's another story in the book from somebody in Singapore who had worked for various companies in Singapore where she'd never come out, never referred to her female partner. But then she moved to a company that was an international company, and she suddenly saw that her partner could be covered by health insurance, and her mind was blown by this because it wasn't just the absolute joy of her partner being included by default, which she'd never had before, but it was the concept that that organization had thought that people like her might be there and sufficiently valued them as to incorporate them into the policy, had this transformational feeling about how she related to that company going forward.
And it's really interesting when you point it out in the sense of if I've got to go and ask for something to be created for me, just that act of itself. And what I think is interesting is when you talk about that is there are going to be situations that people come across. The maternity leave, paternity leave question. You might just be reading the policy to find out just as you're planning ahead or you're looking through things. And so it doesn't necessarily have to impact you in that moment. And you may never want to have kids, but actually you may be looking at that policy and infer other things from it, which is I don't belong here and it doesn't feel. And so what I thought was interesting was the signaling effect. I'd never really thought about the signaling effect of kind of policies and rules internally. But actually, you're right. The way that they're framed and even things that are not relevant to you in that moment could have a significance.
I think that's right. And just seeing yourself there, your needs captured and somebody cares about them is even if it's not something that you need to access, is important. It just made me think of, for example, some people are like, why there's so many identities on a drop down menu. But actually, I had a really interesting conversation with my staff group at my work as part of writing this book. And they were just saying, there's nothing like having to tick the other box to make you feel
Right.
others in an organization. Oh, that was a really good insight. There's a question of rather than making somebody feel that they are other, can they actually just see themselves included in the first place, whatever that policy might be, whether it's the dress policy, whether it's some kind of insurance policy. I spoke to people who were having to move for their job and saw all their colleagues having their their spouse having their expenses paid, their visas sorted out, etc. But then there they were with their same-sex spouse who were not able to access any of those benefits. It's all these things that just need to be baked right in so that you're not making an assumption about how somebody's living and one, right way of doing something. But, as an organization, you know that you've got huge diversity of people, just as the world is a diverse place in all sorts of different ways. So have you actually thought about that when you're developing these policies?
And it was really funny when you were talking about, for example, the drop down thing. I mean, my mind goes to, okay, so generally it's easy for me to find, if it's a question of sex, it's pretty easy for me to find the thing I need. But if I thought about other drop down boxes that are nothing to do with this subject, but illustrate, I think, the human emotion around this. If I go to one where I've got to put in my country, and the UK is a great example because it can appear in also, you might get Great Britain, you might get it broken up into the constituent parts. It might be, I find that deeply irritating when I'm flapping around but I know it's eventually going to be there in some way, shape or form. But I was thinking that, any time that we don't feel like we're catered for, that they haven't planned it for me, I feel left out. And I just thought it's really interesting. If I feel that way about something silly like an address, that's not really going to my identity in the same way. Suddenly I was just like, well, that's so obvious. And with so many of the things that you point out and the way you're talking about it now, it is so blindingly obvious. And maybe blinding is a good word because I think back to my own experience. Wouldn't have occurred to me to think about this. If I was signing off on a policy, and I'm guessing the people that are coding websites or whatever, it's not that they're actively sitting there going, well, how can I make these people feel awkward? It's just, it doesn't even occur to them to do that. And so it is in these very, as you say, in these very small, it's so easy if we just stick to the way we've always done things or we just copy from existing templates to get this wrong. And so there is a concerted effort required. But on the other hand, it is incredibly simple to solve.
Well, absolutely. I mean, when you're saying that, I think one of the examples from the book is at a workplace it did ask most people's sexuality. And somebody inputted that they were a lesbian and they weren't allowed to save it until they said, what date had this started? And what date was it likely to end? And that's just, a simple matter of thinking about how to code something in a sensible way rather than just using the same technique for everything. And then there's so many stories that people tell us about people who have transitioned in their gender and they've perhaps got a different name, they might have a different photograph, all these sorts of things. And just how awkward and difficult and long it can sometimes take an organization to just be able to implement those changes. And it's not as though those are wild changes that nobody's tried to implement before, because of course people quite often change their names, for example, through marriage. But for some reason, there seems to be these sticking points that happen in various IT systems where people just haven't prioritized making sure that something that really, really is going to matter to somebody is sorted out. And I think that's a crux of quite a lot of these policies. You're like, most people may not need this, but there may be certain people for whom whatever this insertion or improvement is going to really make a difference. And not only will it make a difference to them personally, but it could make a difference to the company or the organization because that person will feel like somebody sufficiently cares about them to have made the effort to make sure that that's in, make them feel that they belong and, grow loyalty and engagement with that company.
And so really, I mean, it seems to me that we, and I guess this is part of the reason for writing the book, right? Is to sort of to shine a light on these things and get people to think about them. But it almost seemed to me that when we think about some of the training that people get sent on in organizations, and if I think about sort of working with respect type courses and things that companies do, this kind of stuff is missing. And I think actually there's a really powerful message in there to sort of say, look, here are some small actionable things that you can do that can just make everybody feel welcome. Right. So it's a really positive message here. And I think, what was struck me reading it, I just thought, well, actually, there are some, I can just be a bit more thoughtful about what I do because it's been pointed out to me. And it just seemed to me lots of organizations that are missing this trick. I don't think I've ever been in a course that's been remotely related to anything sort of diversity and inclusion that has thought to teach me this kind of thing. There's a really positive thing here where we could say, look, being inclusive means thinking about some of these things. And let's give you some examples and some tools. I think this would be much more welcoming for people as a message. And so I love the way you point. yes, of course, you want big structural change in organizations and you want people to think more carefully about it. But in the day-to-day interactions and the day-to-day designs and the day-to-day communications, there were these very small steps that we could take. And it struck me that that's a very positive way of looking at inclusion, because you're not asking people to, yes, we want the massive stuff to happen, but we can ask people to do very small things that are very, very simple. It's not difficult to add that extra drop-down box.
That's exactly right. I think there tends to be, I mean, we've all been through quite a lot of EDI type training, diversity, belongingness, all these types of training. And in the book, I don't try to sort of go into here's your standard things, because we've all read many things on that topic.
We're all
We've got
scarred.
a
Yeah.
level a generic level of expertise, which rises depending on your role. But I think that many people who I interviewed reflected that all these different characteristics that people have do have their own things. It can't really all be dealt with in, one generic training. And if you really are interested in trying to improve the belongingness, then it's about how do you increase people's awareness of not just, oh, these people are here, don't be actively offensive, but these people are here and we want, like, they belong in the way that everybody belongs. And here's some stuff that we can do specific to LGBTQ plus people in this instance, or whatever other groups that you're looking at. And yeah, everybody was very compelled by how they hadn't really been on specific courses that focus on LGBTQ plus people. And fair enough, there's all sorts of diversity going. But if you really do care about investing in making the people in your organization, making your colleagues and your staff feel like they belong, and when you feel like you belong, you're able to be your best self. You're able to work better. You're more likely to be retained in the organization. There's lots of benefits to it, so it is worth investing. But sometimes people say it feels like there's a bit of a hierarchy of diversity. There's only so much time and effort that organizations might be able to commit to a certain interventions for diversity. But actually, this is so important because it's about getting everybody working well and feeling well and belonging well and doing the best for your organization. And if you want people to do that, then you need to show that they do genuinely belong.
As you were doing the interviews, was this? I mean, obviously you're approaching it as a piece of research, but how did you feel doing these interviews? Because on the one hand, I could imagine it'd be quite depressing. Keep hearing all these awful stuff. On the other hand, there's a sense I get in the book. It's sort of slightly uplifting in that you enjoyed the process.
Well, I mean, it was lovely speaking to those people, because one of the really interesting things for people, particularly of my age and older, is that when we were growing up, we had pretty much no role models who were LGBTQ plus. Like, when I looked around, I saw almost no person. Um, I mean, on the television, you saw all sorts of horrible things about how people like you might be dying of AIDS, which wasn't necessarily the most motivating thing to see. But genuinely, I didn't know how to aspire to those senior roles because I didn't see anybody like me in those roles. I didn't know if it was possible. And when I had those interviews, lots of people said the same thing. And what was really lovely about doing the interviews was that I had identified all these cool people who had come out at various points. They had their challenges, they'd had various setbacks, but they had surmounted all those things and they'd risen to these really cool roles where they were able to make a really positive difference in the world, achieve their ambitions. And it's just so optimistic to see. I mean, that there's all these quotes that people say, you can't be what you can't see. And it is true. By speaking to those people who'd achieved great things, it made me feel more confident and empowered, and I guess aspirational for what I thought I could potentially achieve in my life. And that was an experience I don't think I knew was going to be part of the interview process. But the more I spoke to those people, the more I thought, yeah, you're right. Being an LGBTQ plus person may have some challenges, but also it is a superpower in various ways. There are ways in which being an LGBTQ plus person actually it's a benefit. So, we've been different from the majority of people. So we've been exposed to this wider range of experiences, which potentially it might give us a wider diversity of thoughts. Because we haven't necessarily conformed to the majority norm, maybe it gives us a bit of a license to do things a bit differently and be a bit more innovative. And knowing what it feels like to be different really gives us an advantage when it comes to empathy when we're working with other people. And, we've spent quite a lot of time thinking about our identity quite often and how we fit into the world. So quite often we will have that additional emotional intelligence that can be helpful. And because we've encountered rejection and harassment and all sorts of things, which many of us have, we tend to have developed that resilience that can also be quite useful in the workplace. And I guess that before I did those interviews, I hadn't ever really sat down and thought, what does being an LGBTQ plus person mean for better and for worse? And I certainly really hadn't thought about it for better. So actually, as they were telling me all these lovely things, I did feel more empowered as a person and in my career. And I think it had quite a personal impact on me as I was bringing together all this information.
I love that, and so many things that I mean, I think the "you can't be what you can't see," it's a little bit cliched, but I think it's incredibly powerful because to your point, you sort of think, "Well, people like me don't make it." Right, and I think that just the idea that one could even think in those terms is a perfect way to shoot aspiration in the foot. You're not gonna make the effort because the system's rigged against me, or, there's no chance of me ever getting to that piece. And so I think it's super, super powerful to have that thing, and I love this idea of you kind of going around and having these conversations, and I guess presumably part of the reason for writing the book was so that other people who have been through your experience can share that joy and sort of read, I'm not alone in this.
Exactly. And as you'll have seen in the book, I'm really explicit about what people's job titles and locations and where they work are. And obviously since then some of them have moved on to different jobs and things. But at the time, I've been very specific. Here's a person who is the CEO of this organization. Because even today, if you think about it, who are the really prominent CEOs or, other C-suite people who are LGBTQ plus, it's not always a visible characteristic. You might just not know. And being quite explicit is quite an important thing. In the book, we talk about visibility and how you as an LGBTQ plus leader can help by being more visible. And so many people were like, well, I assumed that I was visible because, I wasn't hiding it. But actually, it's not always the case unless you unless you are really quite clear that people throughout your organization are aware of that aspect of you, and sometimes that can be really helpful for them. So being really specific was important to me, and in the book, when I've written about all these people and where they work and what they achieve, I think it's really nice for people to be able to look and say, "Well, there's some role models." It's not the case like in my childhood where I had nobody. Here's 40 plus people who are role models for me, and I think it's a really uplifting thing. It certainly was for me. I hope it is for other people.
And I think that point around profile is fascinating because you could, if you were being sort of cynical or ignorant, you might say, well, why are these people flaunting this? Why are they making a big fuss about it? But actually, to your point, because it's not visible, so we can see it with different other forms of diversity. We can see, skin color is obvious, and so we can start to see that. Whereas some of this isn't, and so I think that's a really interesting. It's just because I sort of thought about sometimes you get some very high pro, and you interview some of them in the book, some high profile people, and you could, if you were being cynical about it, just sort of think, well, are they showing? Why are they making a big thing of it? But it makes perfect sense when you frame it in the way you just have, because actually part of the reason for doing that is because it's not visible, and the rationale for them doing it is it's not all about them. And I think there's often a perception that these people are showing off in some way, shape, or form. But that's not the driver behind it. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, this whole concept of flaunting is obviously just a ridiculous concept. It's like if a heterosexual person mentioned their spouse, nobody's going to say, "Oh, look at you flaunting your heterosexuality at us." Stop throwing it in our face. Not suitable for the workplace. You don't you like that. That's
Yes.
almost it's the sort of terminology that LGBTQ plus people get. It's just obviously really inappropriate. It comes from a place of prejudice or just being so unfamiliar. So in some way, it's interesting. In some ways, I tend to talk about being a lesbian, being a gay woman quite a lot because quite a lot of people haven't really had that before. People will often say to me, "Wow, you're the first lesbian I've met." And I'm like, "Really? It is
That's very unlikely.
2024. What are you talking about?" That's People do say that much more often than you would think. And people get to know me and we talk and they're like, "Gosh, I've never really, been friends with an LGBTQ plus person." And to me, that seems really improbable. But that is the situation. When you're in a minority group, it might well be the case that people haven't encountered many folks like that before. Uh, I was uh, I was really interested once. My wife used to be a diplomat, so I was a diplomat's wife. I was always at these ambassadors' receptions, talking to all various people. And one of these people was talking to me, and he was like, "Why are you here?" And I was like, "Oh, that's my wife." And he was at and he was quite perturbed at the concept that I was in. It felt like he didn't like it, and he was potentially going to be a bit unkind about it. So I was bracing myself. And then he told me that his son had just come out as gay, and he'd been really upset about it. But being at that event and speaking to me and hearing about the job that I had at the time, which was quite cool, it was in the world, and hearing about my wife's job, which was obviously being a diplomat, it had given him a different perspective. And he said, I'd been really upset about my son coming out. This is just a few years ago. Really upset about my son coming out because I thought it's going to stop him achieving his ambitions, and it's going to hold him back. And obviously, I've written in the book, that absolutely could. But him seeing that there was me having a reasonably successful career, there was my wife, similarly, it changed how he thought about his son. And, he came up to me at the end of the night and he was like, "This is the most important conversation I had, and I'm going to go home and then I'm going to apologize to my son and have a different conversation with him." And I thought, in some ways, it's quite a good illustration, isn't it, of it can be awkward to be out. It can be awkward for me to mention I'm gay in whatever the scenario is. But it's also sometimes important to do that because people need to see that, we're all just there living our lives, being in jobs, needing whatever policies and support that everybody else gets, and yeah, just getting on with it. And I think it's always surprising if you work in this sort of space or if you are an LGBTQ plus person to see how many people are actually just quite unfamiliar with even seeing someone in a role that's like that.
And you talk in the book about things like the rainbow lanyards that organizations have and people using pronouns. And I'd always sort of thought, well, I get that it's important, but I hadn't quite seen, and this is where the book opened my eyes slightly, that it's just it makes it a more welcoming environment. So, because often the approach I'd had was to say that, well, I don't need to wear these things, right? Because obviously, live and let live. People can do whatever they want, be whoever they want. That's absolutely cool, right? And we all come and we all bring our different. And I hadn't really clocked why these things matter, and so you really opened my eyes to thinking actually, it's not just a sort of gesture thing. It has a bigger impact. Can you talk a little bit about that and why these small, seemingly small things are so significant?
Sure. So yeah, when you talk about something like a rainbow lanyard or, slapping a rainbow on something for pride, sometimes people will be quite critical of it and quite rightly, and they'll call it rainbow washing or pink
Right.
wash. And, the concept being that you're just like slapping on a rainbow and saying, "Oh, look at me. I'm being so great for LGBTQ plus people." But actually you've done nothing except have a rainbow and it doesn't really benefit anybody in particular. So that is one side of it. That is very much the case. So if you're trying to do beneficial things to help with inclusion, then just doing that is probably not going to have much of a help. But if you're doing lots of other things to help support the belongingness of people, then lots of people told me, it really means a lot to see little visible indications that your organization cares about LGBTQ plus people. They call it visible signposting. So if you've got, your boss is wearing a rainbow lanyard, it means something to people. It says, here's a person, whatever their own sexuality or whatever their gender identity, they want to support the belongingness and rights of everyone. And that is something that feels quite important. Pronouns is always an interesting one. It's always in the papers. People are always getting very exercised about specifying your pronouns. But the point is that there are some people who have changed their pronouns or for whom their pronouns may not be immediately obvious from their name or their appearance or whatever. And those people are having to tell people how they want to be referred to. And if nobody else is doing that, that is a really othering, exclusion, non-belonging sort of a feel. But if you've normalized the ability to do that by other people doing it as well, then it makes it a lot easier for people to use it when they need to, and just be a bit clearer about their communications with people without feeling like they are this special other stressful situation that they have to engage with. And I think that these things continue to be quite controversial in the media and things, but like in reality, in the workplace where you're just like dealing with your colleagues, and there's different ways of being respectful and understanding the background of why you would be doing. I think just helps us because we're all just trying to be respectful to each other and help each other feel like we belong and do our best work.
And it's really interesting as you talk. I'm just looking at the screen now, and I can see that you've got yours on, and I haven't got mine on the podcasting. Whereas on LinkedIn, I have. And it's interesting. I was just, as you were talking, I was just thinking, why is that? Well, the answer is the podcasting software doesn't give me the option. And so it had never occurred to me. Whereas on LinkedIn, you have that optionality. My view had always been, well, like if it's easy to do, why not do it? Right? Doesn't like, it's such an easy, simple thing to do. But it's interesting here when I look at the default on this, because it wasn't offered to me, it didn't even occur to me. And so I love these little sort of, the pointers for me there were just to, again, it's just illustrative of I'm not thinking in those terms. The structures that we've designed don't necessarily, and yet it would be so easy to do. We could just tweak these things. So I'm going to get in touch with the podcasting software people and point that out to them.
Well, actually, when I signed in, the reason that I have my pronouns is that it did ask me, and I wouldn't have automatically inputted them. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because we don't automatically do things that are, really specifically inclusive of lots of people. But when we're prompted to do them, then maybe we do. And that is, I was prompted and I duly inputted them today. So it's quite interesting, isn't it?
Well, maybe it's because I've been registered with them a long time and it didn't do it at that point. I'll go back in and change that then. That's good. That's good.
But at the same time, like nobody wants it to be a requirement. It may well be the case that you are actually, evolving in your understanding of your own gender. You might not necessarily want to be committing to particular pronouns
Right.
or talking about them publicly as well. So I think it's all of these things are just a matter of nuance. Like give the opportunity to be as inclusive as possible and take that opportunity when it feels right for you. I think is a really nice way of growing that respect. And yeah, in the book, there's all sorts of interesting ways of doing that that I never really thought about before. And now I'm really interested in how to be more inclusive to all sorts of people. And sometimes you just don't really know. You don't think about it.
Right. Because and I think that's where the interesting opportunity lies, because actually if we can just make these things the default, then we don't have to think about them. And so often it's just a case of one little shift. As back to the drop down box, one little extra thing, add it in, job done. Right? We fix that particular thing. And so I think there's lots of, it's fascinating that what I came away with was a sense of lots of structures where we just haven't, yes, there's prejudice there, absolutely. But there's also just a lack of thought sometimes. And just we haven't considered that might be an issue. And if we can start to think about that, to your point, we can get, you know, we're hiring people, we're paying people. Humans are an expensive resource. If we want to get the best out of them, so why not? In the same way that we want to, we want to make sure we provide water in the office place so people don't dehydrate. Right, it's a legal requirement, but let's ignore that for a second. Right? We provide those sort of and nice working environments. We know that, and so this is just an extension of that. And saying actually, we just need to change some of the other things to make sure that it's more inclusive and that possibly subjects that we might not have considered before, to areas we haven't considered before, we just need to just reflect on that. And if we change the defaults and change the processes, then amazing things can happen.
That's absolutely right. And this is not just for LGBTQ plus people, of course. It's for people with all sorts of different needs and characteristics. But yeah, it feels like it's an area that hadn't been particularly focused on. We didn't really have a good feel for what some of those opportunities were. So really what I've tried to do in the book is just bring them together and say, here we are, here's some things that we can do. Here's some ways of understanding why this has happened in the first place so you can understand your colleagues and your staff, and your bosses and whoever it may be just a bit better. And hopefully it'll really add to our understanding of what to do about it.
And so the book really is obviously it's to help LGBTQ plus people at work, but it's also to help people like me to recognize and understand the dynamics that we control. So it's really there's almost two missions here, right? And two potential audiences.
Exactly. I think the book publishers are probably cursing me for the complexity of where to put it on the shelves. Because yes, in some ways it is a sort of career book for LGBTQ plus people. And in other ways it is absolutely a book for managers, for HR people, for CEOs, from anyone who's working with colleagues and wants to improve things. So it definitely is the case that there's multiple audiences, and of course other audiences as well, like for example parents, teachers, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I would say it's a tricky one to know where to put it on the shelf, but I'm hoping that it has something for all these people.
In fact, well, it definitely impacted me. And you're clearly on a mission here. The book is coming out, pun fully intended. That's going to keep you busy for a while. But where are you going to take things from here? Because my sense is you're not done.
Gosh, I don't know where I'm going to take Victor here. I guess we'll have to see. I mean, at the moment, I continue to work in health policy, which is brilliant, and then I have these opportunities to help support with some of this work around LGBTQ plus inclusion, which is such a personal passion for me. But I do not know where it's going to take me. I guess we'll see.
Fantastic. That's very exciting. Before I let you go, remind people what the book is called. And I used to say where they can get it, but I think it's pretty obvious where to get books from these days. But remind people what the book is called.
It's called Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling: How LGBTQ plus people can thrive and succeed at work. It's published on the 23rd of May in the UK, and it is published by Bloomsbury, and you can literally just buy it anywhere where you would buy books.
Amazing. Fabulous stuff. Whichever department of the bookstore you find it in, and we love physical bookstores, enjoy it because it is a fabulous read. And you've been a great guest on the show. Thank you so much, Layla.
Such a pleasure. Lovely chatting.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Layla for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Layla, her book Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling: How LGBTQ plus people can thrive and succeed at work, have a look in the show notes. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, thanks for joining us. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. It's available on all of the major platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review for it, please do so on whichever platform you're using. It really, really does help. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, and thank you so much for listening.